There was a time when silence could knock a man down harder than any punch. When respect was earned not by shouting, but by standing still. But that time felt long gone. Until one night, when a 28-year-old UFC champion mocked the last man you should ever challenge. Chuck Norris didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just said 5 words. And the whole world stopped breathing. This is the story of what happened next. The lights hit him like a stage, and that was exactly how he liked it. Tanner Maddox didn't just walk into the octagon. He arrived like a storm rolling in from Vegas, buzzing loud and built for the camera. He had the swagger of someone who knew how many followers he gained per win. Every movement was fine-tuned not just for power, but for replay value. Spinning elbows, flying knees. His style wasn't about defense or discipline. It was a spectacle. The crowd fed on it. They screamed at every taunt, every smirk, every time he backed an opponent into the cage with a grin instead of a guard. At 28, he was already a 6-time title holder and unofficial prince of online fight culture. Clips of his knockouts played like music videos on TikTok edited to trap beats and neon filters. His last match ended in less than 2 rounds. A fake low kick followed by a whip-fast hook right behind the ear. His opponent hit the canvas like a dropped statue. Tanner stood over him, arms wide, jaw clenched, soaking in the roar. He didn't look at the man who couldn't get up. He looked into the camera. Commentators called it the cleanest finish of the year. Sponsors doubled. Interview requests poured in. A new energy drink sent him 3 custom-designed cases with his face printed on the cans. He posted an unboxing video in his Lamborghini. Everything about him screamed now. Fast, viral, fresh. But to some eyes, especially older ones, there was something missing in all that shine. Something deeper, something silent. He trained hard. No one denied that. His team was sharp, his routines brutal, his focus real. But every jab felt like a brand. Every win fed a machine. Between the fights, he played the game like a pro content, drops merch, deals podcast bits, and even a VR sparring module with his likeness coded in. To the new generation, he was the future. But in the dusty corners of small gyms across the country, where calloused hands still wrapped wrists with cotton strips instead of neon tape, there were quiet nods of doubt. They didn't say he wasn't good. They just said he hadn't been tested. That was the word they used. Not challenged. Tested. Because the challenge is external, testing is something deeper. It asks what you're made of when the lights cut out and when the cameras stop. When no one is watching but the person across from you who isn't playing to win followers. Tanner didn't care. Or at least that's what he told himself. He had the belt, the fans, the momentum. In his mind, legacy was a word for retired people and documentaries. His world ran on highlights and headlines. After the fight, he leaned back in a gold-trimmed chair and held up 6 fingers for the cameras. His mouth still had that cocky, perfect, half-smile. Reporters buzzed in like bees to honey. Some of them laughed a little too hard at his jokes. And he gave them what they wanted. Catchphrases, swagger, a wink when someone asked who might be next. The truth was, Tanner didn't fear the next guy. He feared the one who didn't care about the belt at all. The one who wouldn't play the part. But that fear was buried too deep for him to see it yet. In that moment on that stage, he was everything the sport seemed to want. Explosive, marketable, loud. But not everyone was clapping. In a quiet gym, somewhere a man older than Tanner's father just shook his head. Not in judgment, in knowing. Because true strength doesn't shout at weights. It watches. And when it moves, it does so without needing to explain itself. Tanner didn't know it yet, but his biggest fight hadn't happened inside a cage. It hadn't even started. It was waiting just outside the reach of his highlight reel. A test that no clip could capture. And it wouldn't come with fanfare. It would come in silence. The press room lights were nearly as bright as the ones in the octagon. Tanner Maddox sat at the center of the long black table shades on a towel around his neck and a belt propped up in front of him like a trophy on a mantel. Cameras clicked nonstop, phones recorded from every angle, and reporters jostled like kids at a candy counter waiting to feed. He leaned into the mic with a grin like the room was his living room. The first question came from a sports blogger with a shaved head and a camera crew of 3. He asked what Tanner thought about the growing conversation around respect in the sport and whether older generations had anything left to teach. Tanner chuckled, rolled his neck like it was a warm-up drill, and said that respect was great for bedtime stories, but this was a different game now. Someone else asked if he'd ever watched the old Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris tapes. The smile widened. He took off his sunglasses, held them in the air for a dramatic pause, and said, yeah, back when his dad had a VCR. Said he remembered one where Chuck did a slow spin kick that probably took longer than an actual fight round. The room laughed. He made sure of it. He leaned forward again, tapping the mic twice, and delivered the line like a closing punch. Those guys were actors, legends in their day maybe. But if Chuck Norris ever walked into the cage today, I'd fold him before he finished his warm-up stretch. The room broke open. Laughter, camera flashes, and hands shooting up for follow-ups. Tanner leaned back, arms stretched along the back of his chair like a king holding court. To him, it was just another viral soundbite. The kind that would double his reach on social media by morning. Within an hour, the clip hit Twitter. Then TikTok. Then there are Instagram Reels, each with a different sound or meme edit. One had a laugh track behind it. Another cut it with Chuck's famous movie scenes. One showed Tanner's comment side by side with a slow-mo kick from an old film, almost as if daring people to compare them. It was gold for the algorithm. But beneath the surface of all that buzz, something else stirred. Not outrage exactly, more like a silence tightening. There's a rule in fighting circles, especially among the older crowd. You don't talk down on the roots unless you're ready to be buried under them. But Tanner had never really grown up with those roots. He'd sprouted fast, raised by highlight culture and gym brands, not dojos and mats that smelled like sweat and patience. The clip eventually reached a different set of viewers. Not the ones scrolling between dance videos and prank fails. The ones who watched it twice. Then again. Then passed it along not with emojis or hashtags, but with short texts that read, "You seen this," or "Just wait." Chuck Norris didn't tweet back. He didn't post a story or do a podcast reaction. He didn't need to. But people close to him began to ask questions. Trainers, students, old stuntmen, and retired cops who had trained under him years ago. They didn't comment either. They just got quiet, and that kind of quiet had weight. Tanner had moved on. His team was already lining up new promos. A sponsored collab with a tech glove company, an exclusive docuseries deal with a streaming app, more lights, more cameras, more of everything. But that clip kept moving. Not louder, just deeper. There's a kind of confidence that feeds off applause, and then there's the kind that waits for the crowd to leave before it even speaks. Tanner didn't know yet, but he'd touched something that didn't clap. Something that didn't care about followers or footage. Because the ego makes a lot of noise, but legacy doesn't need to. Somewhere in a small house in Central Texas, a man in his 80s watched the clip once, then stood up slowly and walked into the next room. No words, just movement. Precise, intentional. The kind that had never depended on speed, only on truth. And somewhere else in a gym with no signs out front, a young fighter paused mid-punch when his coach pulled out a phone and showed him the clip. The coach said nothing, but his eyes said, "This right here. This is why we train differently." Tanner Maddox thought he'd won the room, and for a moment he had. But outside that room, outside the buzz, something older had woken up, and it didn't laugh. It listened. The video was only 23 seconds long. No title, no intro music, no dramatic lighting. Just Chuck Norris standing in what looked like a sunlit garage or a small home gym wearing a plain gray t-shirt and speaking straight into the camera. His tone was calm, steady. He said he'd heard what Tanner Maddox said about him. Then he smiled the kind that barely moved his face and added that he doesn't issue challenges. He accepts invitations. Then he thanked everyone for their time and ended the video. That was it. No threats, no clever jabs, no call to action. But by the end of the day it had more views than Tanner's last 3 fights combined. And not because it was loud, because it wasn't. The silence between Chuck's words seemed to echo louder than any punch. Fans didn't quite know how to take it. Younger ones thought it might be a bluff or some subtle PR stunt. Older viewers watched it once and sat back quietly. They knew better. The media, desperate to spin it into something louder, called it a response, a clapback, an indirect challenge. But none of those labels fit. Chuck hadn't responded. He'd spoken, and the world had heard. Within 24 hours, fight podcasts lit up with speculation. Commentators debated everything from Chuck's age to his legacy. Would the UFC allow it? Could they sanction an exhibition bout between a reigning champ and an 85-year-old legend should they, Dana White, stayed silent for 2 days? Then he posted a single tweet. If it happens, it won't be a fight. It'll be a lesson. From that point on, things moved fast. Too fast for Tanner to control. Negotiations opened behind the scenes, and even though Chuck didn't ask for money or terms, the networks jumped at the chance. The UFC framed it as a once-in-a-lifetime crossover event. Not a contest, a conversation in motion, and the name practically wrote itself the Legacy Round. Tanner agreed, of course. Said it with a smirk during an interview. Called it an honor even while rolling his eyes between words. But part of him felt the shift. The crowd was still cheering, but not just for him anymore. Promos dropped by the weekend. One showed clips of Chuck's old karate matches intercut with Tanner's knockouts. Another used old footage from Walker, Texas Ranger, but slowed down cut with orchestral music instead of action beats. Younger fans posted reaction videos. Older ones just watched quietly. Tickets sold out in less than 4 minutes. What caught people off guard wasn't the hype. It was who was showing up. Men in their 60s, women in their 70s. Veterans. Former black belts. Fathers bringing sons. Grandfathers bringing grandsons. Not to see who would win, but to see something they hadn't seen in years. A presence. This wasn't about fists. Not really. It wasn't even about Tanner. It was about something older. Something many thought had faded out when dojos turned into fitness chains and belts turned into marketing tools. Chuck didn't train in public. No press tours. No interviews. Just that one short video. And somehow that absence said more than any PR blitz ever could. People started whispering that it wasn't going to be a fight at all. That maybe Chuck wasn't coming to strike but to reveal. The tone of the conversation began to change. Comment threads turned quieter. Younger fans who had started by mocking his age began asking questions about his past. Old YouTube videos of Chuck's real-life tournament footage resurfaced. His early championship bouts. His training under Bruce Lee. His time with military combatives. People stopped laughing. Tanner didn't, at least not in public, but somewhere in the rehearsals and the meetings in the mirror he started asking himself what this thing was becoming, what it meant to fight someone who didn't seem to want to win. Because the truth was, Chuck didn't need to win. He wasn't there for that. He was showing up because an invitation had been made, and he'd chosen to accept it. The crowd didn't know what to expect. Tanner thought he did. But deep down, the people who'd been around the block, The ones who'd trained in garages and fought for discipline more than medals they knew. This wouldn't be a brawl. It would be a reminder. The arena pulsed with sound. Music blasted through the rafters. Lights flashed in rhythmic strobe. Backstage crew members shouted over comms cameras, rolled non-stop, and security moved in tight patterns along the halls. Fighters warmed up in corners, striking pads with sharp cracks that echoed off the concrete. Everything buzzed like a machine built to entertain. Then, somewhere behind it all, a door opened. Quietly. Chuck Norris walked in alone. He wasn't flanked by a team. No entourage, no handlers. He wore a dark denim jacket over a plain black t-shirt, jeans, and boots that looked scuffed from years, not fashion. His face didn't hold a smirk or scowl. It held stillness. His eyes were straight, his step was steady, and his hands were relaxed at his sides. He moved like someone who had nothing left to prove because he had already proven it long ago. At first, no one noticed. Then someone did. A young camera op turned and froze mid-step. A trainer stopped mid-punch. A ring official glanced up from his clipboard and lowered it without a word. No one said anything, but the hallway shifted. The noise didn't stop. It just bent around him. Security guards straightened up without knowing why. 2 interns stepped aside, one instinctively removing his cap. A fighter who had once mocked Chuck in an interview just stared at the ground as he passed. Chuck nodded once, not as a greeting, more like a small acknowledgement that he was here, nothing more. He didn't walk with speed. He didn't need to. Time, in some strange way, seemed to adjust itself around his pace. The hallway led to a wide prep area near the cage entrance, a place usually filled with pre-fight energy chatter and nervous tension. But as he stepped in, the buzz softened. Not from silence, but from focus. The kind of hush that happens in a room when something sacred enters without asking to be worshipped. He dropped a small gym bag on the bench, sat down, took off his jacket, slowly folded it once and set it beside him. Then he reached down and pulled out a pair of well-worn shoes. They weren't branded. No logos. Just leather and rubber molded by time. One of the assistants brought over a check-in clipboard. Chuck signed it without looking at the cameras pointed in his direction. One of the production staff asked if he needed anything. He said, "No, thank you." His voice was low and steady. The man stepped back like he'd just shaken hands with history. In a locker room nearby, Tanner Maddox cracked his knuckles and bounced in place music pounding from a speaker beside him. He was surrounded by his team. His energy, sharp adrenaline, high. He hadn't seen Chuck arrive. Not yet, but others had. A veteran referee walked down the hall and stood outside Chuck's prep space. Not to interfere, just to be there. A former champ who hadn't fought in years leaned against a wall across the way, arms folded, watching with a quiet half-smile. They didn't need to speak. They just wanted to witness. There's a power that doesn't need a spotlight. It travels ahead of you, follows behind. It lives in how people feel when you enter a room. That's what Chuck carried. Not fame, not hype, gravity. The music from the arena thundered through the floor. Announcers screamed into microphones. But in that small corner behind the noise, Chuck stretched with slow movements, rolled his shoulders, rotated his neck, not to warm up, to center. He had fought thousands of rounds in his lifetime, most without cameras, most without crowds. That's what made this moment different. Not bigger, just more visible. And yet he treated it the same. One of the event directors approached with a nervous smile, asking if he was ready. Chuck stood and nodded. No speeches, no ritual. He simply walked toward the tunnel. As he passed through the last hallway, something happened. The crew, the fighters, even the medical staff along the wall, they stood still. Not frozen, not in awe, just respectful. Like watching a sunset you didn't know you needed. He paused at the curtain, Lights from the arena flashed ahead. Music blared again as Tanner's name was announced. The crowd exploded. He could hear the rhythm of thousands of voices rising. Chuck closed his eyes, took one long breath, and stepped forward. No arms raised, no theatrics, just presence, and the whole arena, without knowing why, changed. Not quieter, just different. Like the wind had shifted and something ancient had entered. The legend had arrived not with a roar, but with stillness. The bell rang sharp, crisp through the roar of the crowd. Tanner exploded forward. No touch of gloves. No pause to read the room. He came in fast, fluid, and full of noise. Feet, bouncing shoulders, loose fists, twitching with energy. His first strike was a feint, sharp and snappy. The second was real, a right hand that could have ended the night for anyone standing still. But Chuck wasn't standing still. He didn't dodge. He just wasn't there. Not by speed, not by force, by rhythm. As if he'd been listening to a song only he could hear. One step, half breath, a quiet pivot, and the punch past air. Tanner, adjusted, came again. A low kick, a jab, jab, hook. All clean, all practiced, all seen before. None of it landed. Chuck wasn't fighting, not in the way Tanner understood. He didn't throw, didn't counter. He breathed, moved, and watched like a teacher waiting for the student to stop showing off. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. At first, they cheered every strike Tanner threw. But after the third clean miss, the noise shifted. Not down, just uncertain. Tanner smiled through it, shrugged for the cameras, threw in a spinning elbow. Flashy, fast. The kind of move that made reels go viral. But Chuck had already taken a step back before it left the ground. Not fast, just early. There was something in the way he stood that messed with the rhythm, like time bent slightly around him. Tanner circled lips tight now. He faked a clinch. Chuck didn't resist. He simply drifted. Not away, not around, through. It wasn't evasion, it was an absence, and it rattled something. Tanner pushed harder. The exit sequence came fast. A triple combo, low-high-mid, then a feint kick to a body hook. Still nothing. Chuck's hands didn't even rise in defense. They floated near his waist, ready but calm. Always aware. Never strained. Tanner barked under his breath, the kind of sound a fighter makes when the game plan stops working. Chuck blinked once. That was it. Seconds passed like minutes. Tanner paced now, jaw tight. Sweat is already starting to build. Not from effort, from frustration. Chuck hadn't landed a punch, but Tanner hadn't landed a presence. A shot came in low. Chuck shifted back. His heel brushed to the edge of the mat. Tanner charged again, trying to trap him, but there was no trap to spring. The older man moved like water drawn into shape. The commentators tried to keep up. They called it patience, experience, but that wasn't quite it. This wasn't a strategy, it was a philosophy, a different rule book. One Tanner didn't know he was breaking until it was too late. Halfway through the round, something subtle happened. Chuck stepped forward for the first time. Just one small measured step, and Tanner flinched. It wasn't obvious, barely visible, but it was there. A twitch of the shoulder, a shift in balance. A second thought where before there had only been an attack. That moment landed harder than any punch. The audience caught it. Older viewers leaned forward. Younger ones grew quiet. Something was shifting. Tanner reset, pulled back, and bounced in place like a man needing to remind himself he was younger, faster, and stronger. He shook out his arms, rolled his neck, and whispered something to himself. Then he rushed again. Another kick. A follow-up cross. Chuck raised his hand. Once. Lightly. The block was so casual it looked accidental. But the punch stopped dead in its tracks. Tanner's wrist caught gently midair. Then nothing. Chuck let it go, took one step back, and stood. No rush, no counter, just that same maddening stillness. Tanner stepped away, this time slower, breathing heavier. The cage hadn't changed. The crowd was still there, but a fight that was slipping out of his hands, he was swinging at a man who wasn't playing the same game, not even on the same field. He glanced toward his corner. One of his coaches shouted something urgent. The other just watched, arms crossed. Chuck rolled his shoulder once, like brushing off dust. Then he dropped into a stance. Still no aggression, just readiness. And that readiness said something loud, something clear. I'm not here to win. I'm here to show you why you're not winning. Tanner didn't hear those words, but he felt them, somewhere under the adrenaline, somewhere behind the pride. A part of him, small, quiet, hidden, knew something ancient had entered the cage. Not a fighter, a mirror, and he wasn't sure if he liked what he saw in it. Tanner's chest rose faster now, not because he was tired, because he was confused every time he struck. It was like swinging into fog. It looked solid, it even felt close, but there was nothing to grab. No impact, no control. Chuck was still in front of him, hands low, body relaxed, breathing steady. He hadn't thrown a single punch. Not one. But he had erased Tanner's rhythm, and rhythm was where Tanner lived. He circled again, trying to reset. His footwork grew choppier. Less bounce, more stomp. A hint of agitation crept in with every step. He was used to reactions, flinches, panic. He could smell fear in most opponents by now, but Chuck smelled like patience, the kind that doesn't break, the kind that waits. Tanner snapped a side kick, fast, sharp, meant to rattle, to shake something loose. Chuck absorbed it, shifting his weight barely an inch, letting the force roll off like rain hitting a tarp. Then he moved his hand forward. Just one, light and slow. It didn't strike. It reached. Tanner's body instinctively shifted to parry it, but the motion was wrong. The angle was off. Chuck's hand brushed the inside of his elbow, redirected it gently, and for a fraction of a second, Tanner's balance slipped. Not enough to fall, but enough to feel it. That single moment lasted longer than anything else in the fight. Tanner caught himself, reset his legs, and blinked. Something in his chest tightened. He'd been touched. Not hit. Touched. And it had more effect than any punch he'd ever taken. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't know what had just happened. But Chuck stepped back again. Hands, calm, eyes steady, like he had said something without speaking. Tanner swallowed. Hard. He came again this time, not for the crowd, not for the show, but for control. A fast hook, tight and clean, a follow-up elbow, but both were gently brushed away. Not blocked, not dodged, redirected. Every time he pushed, Chuck gave. Every time he gave, Chuck returned it with silence. The air in the cage shifted. Tanner blinked sweat from his eyes. But it wasn't sweat that blurred him. There was doubt, and doubt in a fighter like him was poison. His hands came up not in defense, but in hesitation. Chuck moved forward again, slowly, just a few steps. But the space between them shrank like a room closing in, and Tanner felt his back hit the cage wall. Not physically, psychologically. He threw another combination this time with more power, anger behind it. Chuck moved like a shadow. In, around, through. The final parry came not with force but with intention. He touched Tanner's wrist, shifted it, and gently pushed his shoulder offline. Tanner stumbled back 2 steps. That was it. No hit, no pain, just an imbalance. On national television, his face flushed. Something cracked. It wasn't his body. It was the part of him that believed he was untouchable. The voice in his head that always said he was in control. That voice was quiet now. He looked at Chuck, really looked, and saw no aggression, no challenge, just stillness. The kind of stillness that has already seen the storm and waited it out. Tanner backed up again, this time without a strategy. He needed space, not to plan, to breathe. The crowd didn't roar, they murmured. Even the commentators grew quiet. because they all knew something had shifted. It wasn't about age anymore, or speed, or power. It was about presence. Chuck had stepped into the ring without weapons, but he had something else. A truth Tanner couldn't touch. And it rattled him. Not just because he was losing the fight, but because for the first time he didn't know what fight he was in. Something changed around the 3rd minute of the 2nd round. It wasn't dramatic. No single strike or fall. Just a slow hush, like air being let out of a room full of noise. The crowd, once shouting with every feint and miss, began to lean forward, not to cheer, to witness. Tanner's movements had slowed not from exhaustion, but from searching. He was still throwing, still circling, but the speed had softened. The sharpness dulled. The aggression no longer drove him. Chuck was no longer just evading. He was teaching. Without words, without pause, his body moved with meaning. Every step drew a question. Every angle held a mirror. Tanner lunged again, a fast jab with a low shift. But the opening he thought was there had already moved. Chuck didn't counter. He just stood still. The kind of stillness that makes you question what motion is for. Tanner pulled back, looked at him. Not like an opponent. Like a puzzle. Chuck adjusted his stance slightly. Just enough to realign. His eyes didn't challenge, they welcomed. The audience sensed it. A kind of reverence rolled through the arena. Phones stopped recording. Commentators softened their tone. The spectacle had faded. What remained was something older, quieter. Tanner breathed in through his nose. He stepped forward again. This time, no flash, no flare, just movement. Honest and unsure. He threw a kick, measured. Chuck absorbed it, gave no reply, then stepped just close enough to test the space. His hand moved up not to strike but to draw. A curve through the air. Tanner flinched. Not from fear. From recognition. He'd seen that shape before. In training footage, in old tapes, in dreams. Chuck's presence wasn't forced. It was clarity. And clarity is a kind of pressure. Tanner backed away again, no longer to reset, just to think. He dropped his hands slightly, not in defense, in openness. Something inside him cracked again, not like before. This time it wasn't ego-breaking. It was noise falling away. The silence between them was filled with something sacred. Not religion, not mysticism, just truth. Tanner didn't want to win anymore. He wanted to understand. What made this man so still, so calm? How could someone meet violence with such grace and make it feel like you were the one being healed? He tried a jab again, not to land it, just to feel what came back. Chuck moved his arm, barely. A deflection, soft as paper. But in that motion, Tanner felt it. The lesson. Fighting isn't about control. It's about letting go of the need to dominate. Tanner dropped his stance, stepped back again. His chest rose, fell. His face looked different. Younger. Not because he was performing, because he had stopped performing. And in that moment, the crowd knew it too. The fight was over, not by rule, not by knockout, but by awakening. Chuck took one last step forward. Slow. Then he bowed. Simple, respectful, complete. Tanner stared for a second, then returned the bow. The cage had become something else, a place of remembering, of becoming. And everyone watching from the front row to the last knew they had just seen something rare. Not a fight, a transformation. Tanner's breath came hard now, not from fatigue, but from something heavier. His gloves dropped to his sides for a moment as he turned in a slow circle, trying to recenter. The crowd was still almost breathless, like a church right before a prayer. Chuck stood across from him, calm, silent. Still breathing, like he had just walked into the cage, not danced through 5 minutes of movement. His feet were planted not for balance, but for being. He wasn't waiting. He was simply present. Tanner's fists tightened again. His face twisted with something between rage and confusion. He stepped forward fast, then stopped himself halfway through the motion. He wasn't even sure what he was trying to throw. It had no shape, no point. He stared across the cage. Say something. Do something. Fight me. The words weren't spoken, but they were in his posture, in the twitch of his jaw, in the ache behind his eyes. And then, finally, he let them go. Hit me. Just hit me. The words ripped from his chest, loud, raw. He shouted them so hard, his voice cracked mid-syllable. It echoed across the arena like a flare in a silent sky. Chuck didn't flinch. He stepped forward. One small, steady step, then another. Tanner's fists came up, then dropped, then halfway up again. He didn't know what to do with them anymore. Chuck came closer. One more step, now within reach. And Tanner froze. Chuck looked into his eyes, deep, unblinking, like a man who had already seen what Tanner was still trying to hide. Then, quietly, he spoke. I'm here to teach you. 5 words, nothing more. They didn't echo like the shout. They didn't need to. They landed more softly, but deeper. The kind of depth that shakes something loose from the inside. Tanner's mouth opened, then closed. His hands dropped again. Not from defeat, from understanding. His breath stilled. All the weight he'd been carrying, the pride, the pressure, the performance began to slip away. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to let something else in. He looked at Chuck again, and this time he didn't see an old man. He didn't see a challenge. He saw a reflection. Not of what he was, but what he could be if he stopped chasing and started listening. Chuck didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The lesson had already been given. Tanner stepped back, then sank to one knee. Not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. The cage, once a place of battle, now felt like a classroom. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They just watched, held still, witnessed something they couldn't explain but knew was rare. Tanner took one long breath. In, out. And in that pause, something broke. But not in the way things usually break. It wasn't shattering. It was released. And in that release he found something he'd never looked for. Humility. The fight was over. But the real journey had just begun. There was no final bell, no dramatic finish, just stillness. Tanner stood in the center of the cage, his gloves hanging heavy at his sides. Chuck had already stepped back, hands down, eyes lowered like the last note of a song that didn't need applause. The crowd didn't roar, they didn't chant. For the first time in the arena's long history, they simply stood there. Quiet. Still. A few people clapped softly, unsure if they should. Most just watched. Tanner returned slowly. His feet felt heavier than they had coming in, not from exhaustion, but from everything he no longer needed to carry. He walked toward the cage door. No fist raised. No show for the cameras. Just breathe. Deep and slow. His corner team met him halfway, but no one reached out. They saw it. The shift. Not in his record, but in his posture. He wasn't the same man who had walked in, and they didn't want to interrupt whatever was settling in. He stepped out of the cage without looking back. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't need to. Some things, once received, don't need to be revisited. They just stay with you. Chuck stood near the far side of the cage, still inside. He bowed once more. Not for Tanner. Not for the crowd. For the moment. Then he turned and walked toward the same gate. His steps were quiet, measured, like they'd always been. Outside the cage, the lights dimmed slightly. The crowd began to shift in their seats. Still no music. Still no announcements. Just the sound of people breathing, in the wake of something they couldn't quite name. Tanner sat on the edge of the steps near the locker room. He didn't take off his gloves yet. His chest rose and fell like it was catching up to the moment. Every cheer from his past echoed faintly in his mind. But none of them mattered now. He thought about the punches he didn't land, the ones he never received, the lessons between the spaces. There was no winner. No scoreboard, no judge's card, but something had clearly ended, and something else, something harder to measure, had just begun. A producer came by, whispering something about post-fight interviews. Tanner looked up slowly, then shook his head once. The producer understood. He left without another word. In the seats, a man in his 70s wiped his eyes with a napkin. A teenage boy next to him sat forward, arms resting on his knees, silent. They didn't talk, but they were connected. This wasn't a fight people would remember because of action. It was one they'd remember because of what they felt long after it ended. Tanner finally stood again. His legs were steady now. It was not like before when they danced for the crowd, but grounded, rooted. He looked down the hallway where Chuck had walked and nodded to no one in particular. Not to say thank you, but to say I understand. No one asked for an autograph. No one rushed through the hallway. The energy had shifted from fame to reverence, from noise to meaning. Somewhere outside, people were already trying to upload clips. But the truth of the moment, the silence, the transformation, the stillness after everything stopped, that part couldn't be captured on video. Tanner took off his gloves slowly. He held them in his hands for a long time, not as a symbol, as a memory. The hallway was quiet, tucked behind the arena's back corridor where no cameras reached. The walls were scuffed, the lights dim, and the air carried the faint scent of sweat and old vinyl mats. Tanner stood there for a long moment before knocking lightly on the open door. Chuck was seated on the wooden bench inside, slowly unlacing his shoes. No one else was around, just the two of them, and the silence they both seemed to respect. Tanner didn't speak right away. He stepped in, shut the door behind him, and stood there like a man learning how to be still for the first time. His hands hung loose. His shoulders for once weren't puffed with pride. They were soft, unarmored. Chuck looked up and gave a small nod. That was all the invitation Tanner needed. He sat on the bench across from him, elbows on his knees, eyes on the floor. For a while, neither said anything. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, like the air had weight, but in a good way. Tanner finally spoke, his voice lower than usual. He didn't ask about the fight. He didn't make excuses. He just asked the one thing that had been echoing in his mind since the cage went still. How do you carry power like that without needing to use it? Chuck sat back thoughtful, not surprised by the question. Just be patient with it. He ran a hand across his knee, then looked Tanner in the eye. Because real power isn't loud, and it's not mine. It's borrowed, and you return it by not misusing it. Tanner nodded slowly. He didn't understand all of it, not yet, but he felt it. Deep, in a place that hadn't been touched by applause or sponsors. Chuck leaned forward and rested his hands on his thighs. He told him that patience was a muscle, not a gift. It grows only when you stop feeding the part of yourself that wants to be seen first. Tanner let the words settle. There was no rush to fill the space, no hunger to impress, just quiet listening. Chuck reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card. It was plain white, the edges slightly bent. He handed it to Tanner with 2 fingers. On it was a handwritten number. Just that. No name, no logo, no message. Tanner looked at it for a moment, then back up at him. He didn't ask what it meant. He understood. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't an invitation. It was a door, left slightly open, for whenever he was ready. Chuck stood slowly. Tanner rose with him. They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. They just stood there, side by side for a moment, like 2 people who had stopped being strangers. Chuck looked him in the eye once more. Next time, don't fight yourself first." Then he walked out of the room. Tanner stood there alone, card still in hand. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, but something inside him was quieter now, calmer. Not because he had answers, but because he had a place to start asking better questions. The gravel crunched under Tanner's boots as he stepped out of the rental car. The sun was just starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the open Texas land. The building in front of him was small, wooden, and plain. No signage, just a screen door and the soft hum of cicadas in the trees nearby. He stood there for a minute, unsure if he had the right place. The address matched the one on the card, but it didn't feel like a gym. There was no parking lot full of SUVs, no neon lights, no banners with his face on them. He opened the screen door, and it creaked like something out of a movie. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust, sweat, and cedar. The floors were polished wood, worn smooth by time. A few mats sat rolled up in the corner. A small group stood in quiet rows, warming up together. No music, just breathe, movement, focus. Chuck stood at the front adjusting the sleeve of his guy. He looked up and nodded. No smile, no surprise, just acknowledgement. Tanner stepped in and shut the door behind him. The others glanced over briefly, then returned to their practice. No one asked for a selfie. No one even said his name. He stood near the edge of the mat, hands fidgeting at his sides. For a man who'd walked into packed stadiums with fireworks and flashing cameras, the silence felt sharp. He wasn't sure where to go, how to stand, what to do with all that attention he no longer had. Chuck walked over, handed him a folded white belt, and gestured to an open spot on the floor. That was all. Tanner nodded and bowed before stepping onto the mat. The first 10 minutes were all breathing drills. No fighting, no forms, just learning how to stand still. Tanner's body resisted it. He kept shifting his weight, glancing around, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Time slowed. The dojo didn't run on performance. It ran on presence. They moved into basic stances. Tanner's muscles were strong, but his balance was off. Every time he tried to push through with force, Chuck corrected him with the lightest tap or word. Softer. Less. Breathe. By the time class ended, Tanner's shirt was damp, not from effort, but from letting go of the tension he hadn't realized he carried. He stood at the edge of the mat, holding his belt in both hands, watching as the others bowed and cleaned up without rushing. No one talked about UFC. No one cared about his win streak. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to see. Chuck walked over, handed him a folded towel, and said nothing more than good work. Then he turned and walked into the small office behind the mats. Tanner sat on the edge of the bench, breathing slowly. No cameras, no claps, just the rhythm of quiet steps on polished wood, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The late afternoon sun poured in through the high windows, drawing long lines of gold across the floor. The dojo was quiet, the way a forest gets quiet after a storm. The students were sitting in a loose circle, sweat cooling on their backs, the air filled with breath and stillness. Chuck stood at the center, arms folded loosely. He looked down for a long moment, then spoke not loud but steady. His words fell into the room like stones into water. Martial arts, he said, is subtraction, not addition. Tanner blinked, letting it settle. He sat cross-legged near the edge of the circle, his notebook open on one knee. He didn't look down to write. Not yet. You spend your youth adding things, Chuck continued. Muscle, speed, power. Then you add fame. Fear, the need to be seen. And one day, if you're lucky, you realize it's too heavy to carry. There was no movement in the room. Just breathe. The slow kind that happens when people stop pretending. So you start subtracting, he said. You strip it all away. The audience, the anger, the stories you told yourself to feel bigger. Chuck turned slowly, letting the silence speak between his words. When it gets quiet enough, what's left is the part that matters. That's where the real work begins. Tanner wrote it down each sentence like a small truth being carved instead of spoken. He didn't look up. His hand moved slowly. He wanted to remember how it sounded, how it felt. Chuck sat down on the mat with them. No rank, no distance, just a man among students. Legacy, he said after a long pause, isn't something loud. It's not what people chant after a fight. It's what stays behind when you're gone, and most of the time it whispers. Tanner let the pen rest in his hand. His throat felt tight, but not from pride or shame. It was something deeper, a kind of recognition, like he'd found something he didn't know he'd lost. No one applauded. No one asked questions. They just sat there the way people sit around a fire when the flames are low and the words have run out. Not waiting, just holding something important together. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, a lesson landed, and it stayed. The lights dimmed as Tanner stood at the edge of the tunnel waiting for his cue. The music started low and steady, not designed to hype the crowd but to anchor him. He didn't bounce or shadowbox. He just walked. No sunglasses, no entourage. Just him. The crowd saw him before the spotlight found him. Some stood unsure if they should cheer yet. Others clapped softly. They remembered the old Tanner, but this wasn't him. He stepped into the cage without a flourish, touched the canvas with one hand, breathed in, then up to his feet and into his corner eye's calm chest still. The fight began like any other, but it didn't feel the same. Tanner didn't chase, he didn't rush. He let the first few exchanges happen like a man watching the tide roll in. When he moved, it was measured. When he struck, it was clean. No wasted motion. No wild flurries. His opponent was tough, young, hungry, the kind of fighter Tanner used to be. But Tanner didn't meet that hunger with fire. He met it with clarity. The crowd noticed the difference, not in the speed or strength, but in the space, the pauses, the way Tanner let things unfold. Like he was fighting in conversation, not shouting to be heard. Midway through the second round, he landed a clean right hand, followed by a step-in elbow. His opponent stumbled. Tanner paused, didn't pounce. I just watched Gave's space and waited for the ref. The stoppage came seconds later. It was clear. Fair, no drama. Tanner stepped back and held up one hand. Then he helped the other fighter to his feet. The cameras zoomed in, hoping for a Flexa scream, something to make the clip go viral. But he just nodded, bowed once, then wrapped his arm around the kid and walked him to his corner. The belt was handed to him a few minutes later. He didn't lift it over his head. He looked at it for a moment, then held it low against his chest. Not as a prize, as a reminder. He stood in the center of the cage, not reaching for the mic. Not feeding the crowd, just being. And in that stillness, the arena found something better than hype. They found respect, not just for Tanner, but for what he had become. The sky was just beginning to shift when Tanner stepped out onto the hotel balcony. The city below hadn't woken up yet. The street lights were still glowing soft against the quiet pavement. He held a cup of black coffee in both hands, not for the caffeine, but for the warmth. His phone was inside, face down on the desk. Notifications had been piling up all night, but he hadn't checked a single one. There would be interviews messages and headlines. He didn't need any of it this morning. The fight already felt like it had happened a long time ago. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't define him anymore. It was part of a process, not the point of it. He took a slow sip and let the heat settle behind his ribs. The sunrise pushed gently through the cloud line, casting streaks of orange across the skyline. For the first time in a long time, Tanner didn't feel the need to move. He just watched. A memory came to him. His father was sitting at the kitchen table, boots, unlaced sleeves rolled up, staring at nothing in particular. He used to say a real man doesn't have to raise his voice or his fists to be heard. He just needs to know who he is when no one's watching. Back then, Tanner didn't understand it. He thought strength was something loud, something that made other people step back. Now, years later, with the belt lying in a drawer and the noise behind him, it made more sense. Strength wasn't in the moment you hit. It was in the space before you decided to. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the cold metal railing. A breeze passed through quiet and clean. He closed his eyes for a moment and let it carry the weight off his shoulders. There was no fire inside him now, no hunger to be seen. What he felt was steadier. It didn't buzz, it didn't burn. It just held. He thought about calling Chuck, then decided against it. Some things don't need to be said right away. Some things just sit with you like early sunlight on bare skin. The street below began to stir. One car, then another, but up here it was still. Tanner finished the last sip of coffee and held the empty cup in his lap. He didn't plan his next move. He didn't think about the next fight. He just let the moment exist. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't chasing something. He was finally learning how to be still. Tanner sat at the edge of the bed, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the screen. The hotel room was quiet except for the faint hum of the mini-fridge. It was early, still barely past 7. He stared at the number Chuck had written on the card all those months ago. He had carried it folded in his wallet like something sacred. Never dialed it until now. He typed out a short message. Simple, no pretense. Good morning, sir. Thank you. I'm ready to learn if the door's still open. He hit send and waited. Not with nerves, with something closer to calm. The reply came 2 minutes later. Call me. He took a breath, hit the number, and brought the phone to his ear. It rang once, maybe twice. Then Chuck picked up. There was no hello, just silence, and then his voice. Quiet, steady, like always. Tanner said his name, said thank you again. He meant it more now than he had in the cage. It wasn't for the fight, it was for what came after. Chuck asked how he was feeling. Tanner said he was good, then paused, then said tired. Not physically, just tired of the noise, tired of pretending to have it all figured out. Chuck didn't rush in with answers. He let the pause stretch, then asked what Tanner was looking for. Not belts, not wins, not even clarity. Discipline, Tanner said. Something to hold on to when no one's clapping. When the lights are off and the room's empty. Chuck spoke slowly, as if each word had to be earned before it was said. Discipline's not built in the cage. It's built in the hallway outside it. It's not the hours you're seen. It's the ones you give quietly without keeping score. Tanner nodded, though Chuck couldn't see it. He gripped the phone tighter. Chuck told him the work wasn't about starting over. It was about letting go of everything that wasn't real. That mastery isn't a mountain. It's a circle. You walk it long enough, and one day your steps start to sound like silence. They didn't talk long, maybe 10 minutes, but it was enough. Before they hung up, Chuck said one last thing. When the world stops watching, that's when the real practice begins. Tanner sat still for a while after the call ended. He didn't feel fired up. He felt grounded. Not because of what came next, but because for once he wasn't in a hurry to find out. Tanner sat at the old wooden table in his apartment, a single lamp casting soft light across the paper. The window beside him was cracked open, letting in a slow breeze that rustled the edge of the page. He stared at the blank sheet for a long time before writing the first word. He didn't know why today was the day. Maybe it was the phone call. Maybe it was the silence that followed. Either way, something inside him had asked to be said. Not out loud, not to the world, just to the boy he used to be. He started simple. Hey, I know you're trying, even if you don't show it, even if you pretend you don't care. The pen moved slowly. He didn't rush. He let the thoughts come as they were not polished. just honest. I know why you act the way you do. Why do you flex in front of mirrors and post things online like you're untouchable? I know the feeling of walking into a room and wondering if you matter unless someone says you do. I know about the fear, the kind you won't name, the one that whispers maybe you're not enough when the crowd goes quiet. I know about the anger, too. The way you use it is Ike armor. Like if you swing first, maybe no one will see how lost you are. There was a pause. Tanner looked out the window. A few cars rolled by. Somewhere below, someone was walking a dog. The world went on. He turned back to the page. I used to think winning would fix it. That if I beat enough people, maybe I'd stop feeling small inside. I thought strength meant being louder, hitting harder, staying in control. But strength isn't that. It's walking away from a fight you don't need to win. It's listening more than talking. It's okay not to be the center of attention. He swallowed hard. And it's learning to sit with yourself in the quiet. That's the part they don't teach you when the cameras are rolling. He wrote more slowly now. You're going to mess up. You're going to hurt people. You're going to say things that sound confident, but are really just fear in disguise. But someday, if you're lucky, someone's going to show you what real power looks like. And it won't be loud. It'll be quiet and steady. And it'll stop you in your tracks. You'll think it's a weakness at first because it doesn't perform, but then you'll feel it. And something inside you will start to break in a good way. He set the pen down for a second. Let the words breathe. Let the silence between them hold what he couldn't say directly. He picked it up again. One day you'll stop chasing. You'll stop looking for applause in every corner. And when that day comes, I hope you forgive yourself for the boy you were. Because he tried. Even when he didn't know how. And I'm proud of him. Tanner leaned back in the chair, eyes still on the page. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The words weren't for anyone else, just for him. And that was enough. The building had once been a mechanic's garage. The walls were still marked with oil stains near the corners, and the back window didn't quite close all the way. But Tanner liked that. It wasn't polished. It felt earned. The floor had been cleaned and padded, with thick gray mats stitched together by hand over 3 long weekends. No logo on the front, just a plain wooden sign above the door with 3 words burned into the grain. Stillness, strength, respect. Inside, there were no trophies, no highlight reels playing on screens, just space to move and space to listen. The only thing hanging on the wall was a black and white photo. Chuck was frozen mid-form, his balance perfect, and his gaze was soft but locked in. Below it is a simple caption. Real strength is humble. Tanner had hung it himself right before the first class. He didn't tell anyone why. He didn't need to. The room filled with the soft shuffle of small feet as the kids filed in. Some were quiet eyes, wide unsure what this place would ask of them. Others were loud, bouncing between mats full of energy that hadn't yet found direction. Tanner watched them from the center of the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tell them who he was. Most didn't recognize him anyway, and that felt right. He bowed once, and the room slowly followed. They started with breath, not punches, not kicks, just learning how to be still in a world that rarely lets you. He walked through the lines, slowly correcting postures with soft hands, teaching how to stand, how to fall, how to get back up. When one boy rolled his eyes and mumbled that it was boring, Tanner knelt beside him and said nothing. He simply mirrored the breath, slow and steady. And after a minute, the boy followed. There were no speeches, no lessons wrapped in grand metaphors, just repetition, patience. The slow rhythm of discipline lands one small moment at a time. After class, the kids lined up for dismissal, still catching their breath. Some high-fived each other. A few asked if they'd be allowed to come back. Tanner nodded, smiled, and handed each one a small card with their name handwritten on it. Not a certificate, just a place to belong. One of the younger girls stayed behind, asking if she could look at the picture on the wall. Tanner walked over and stood with her, both of them gazing up at it. She asked who he was. He said he was a teacher. She nodded, like that made sense. Then she ran to catch a ride. Tanner stayed in the room after the last kid left. He swept the mats with long, even strokes, wiping sweat and dust into the corners. When he finished, he sat on the floor legs, folded eyes back on the photo. There was no crowd, no camera, no paycheck. But this was the real win. Passing something on. Not a technique, a way of being. And in that quiet space, under the watchful gaze of the man who had once taught him the same Tanner, felt what legacy really meant. Not what you earn, what you give away. Funny thing about strength. Most people spend half their lives trying to prove they have it. The other half learning it's not something you prove, it's something you carry. I watched Tanner come up like a wildfire. Loud, fast, bright enough to make people look, but not steady enough to last. And I don't say that as a judgment. I say it because I've seen it before. When you're young, you think power lives in your fists. And how hard you hit. How many people did you beat? But real strength doesn't shout. It listens. It waits. And when it moves without needing applause. The day he stepped into the cage with me, I didn't see an enemy. I saw a mirror. Not of who I was, but who I could have been if someone hadn't reached me in time. So, I didn't fight him. I showed him the silence. Took him a while to understand. That's how it works. You can't rush someone into wisdom. You just leave the door open and hope they find it when they're ready. He found it. Not in the lights, not in the belts, but in the spaces between the noise. In the quiet mornings, in the days when no one was clapping. That's where the truth sits. And that's where he started to listen. I never told him what to be. I just showed him how to stop performing, how to stop proving, how to start being. Now he teaches. Not with force, but with presence. And if you're listening to this, maybe you've lived long enough to know what that means. Maybe you've been loud before. Maybe you've chased your name into places that never called it back. Or maybe you're just learning how to sit with yourself. That's a kind of strength, too. We don't always get to see the seeds we plant grow. But when we do, it's not flashy, it's not loud. It looks like a boy becoming a man. Then a man becomes a guide. So if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Real strength is quiet. Real legacy is service. And the loudest truths often live in the softest voices. Listen for them. They're still speaking.